Well, we're wrapping up Abraham's story today with this incredible picture of love and grace and God's provision. It really sets the tone for all future understanding of sacrifice, of the whole temple system, and in some really clear ways points us straight to Jesus and what his death represents for us. So let's jump into Genesis 22. Genesis 22, 1 through 14. After these events, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." Abraham answered, "I'm here." God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up as an entirely burnt offering there on one of the mountains that I will show you." Abraham got up early in the morning, harnessed his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, together with his son Isaac. He split the wood for the entirely burnt offering, set out, and went to the place God had described to him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place at a distance. Abraham said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will walk up there, worship, and then come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the entirely burned offering and laid it on his son Isaac. He took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." Abraham said, "I'm here, my son." Isaac said, "Here's the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the entirely burned offering?" Abraham said, "The lamb for the entirely burned offering, God will see to it, my son." The 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place God had described to him. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. But the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." Abraham said, "I'm here." The messenger said, "Don't stretch out your hand against the young man, and don't do anything to him. I know now that you revere God and didn't hold back your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw a single ram caught by its horns in the dense underbrush. Abraham went over, took the ram, and offered it as an entirely burned offering instead of his son. Abraham named that place "The Lord Sees." That is the reason people today say, "On this mountain the Lord is seen." Okay, this passage raises a lot of questions for a lot of people. I think especially in our modern age, we are offended, and rightly so. If God is actually demanding a child sacrifice, how dare he? Even if it's a pretend sacrifice, even if we say, well, how could God even put Abraham through that, put Isaac through that, if he knew that he was going to stop? What's going on here? There are some approaches that are going to be helpful for understanding this. One, we want to read the whole story as a whole. The biblical authors have the beginning and the end in mind the entire time, so we can't stop short and say, oh, how dare God demand a child sacrifice when we know that the ending is he actually didn't. It also tells us a big clue here. God tested Abraham. Actually, from line 1, as a reader, we should know that something else is going on here. God tested Abraham. So this whole thing is a test. What kind of test is it? He goes, he says, "I want you to offer up your son." Now this is coming near the end of Abraham's story. And again, Abraham's life is a foundational story for the whole way Israel will later interact with God. And this is a really important scene. So this, coming at the end of Abraham's story, he's now gone through this covenant with God. God has said, "I'm going to promise to make you a great nation." And he's made it very clear that Isaac is the son of the promise. Isaac is the one that is going to happen. And now it almost seems like God is reversing. He's saying, now take your son, Isaac, and offer him as a burned offering. What's going on here? The thing that's been most helpful for me is to understand some of the ancient world here, where child sacrifice is a regular thing. It's not a regular thing in our day and age, thankfully. But in the ancient world, there were many gods and many nations that child sacrifice was a normal way of offering ultimate obedience and devotion to the gods. And so in that world, in the ancient Near East, to have a god, this part actually is not as shocking as the end. The beginning of this story for an ancient reader would not have felt shocking at all. Oh, here's another god who just like all the rest, And so in the Old Testament, we have gods like Molech, who regularly demand child sacrifices. And so if you're reading this as an ancient reader, this part of the story would not have actually been a surprise. You would have said, well, here's another one. Here's another God that demands child sacrifices. Actually, the shock of all shocks comes at the end. The fact that God provided another way, that God said no, becomes really important. And then from then on out, God actually makes it really clear he will never demand a child sacrifice. It's like he had to take Abraham to the brink to really pound home, not just for Abraham, but for all of Israel. God is a God who will never demand a child sacrifice. And that becomes one of the ways that God is known. God will never demand a child sacrifice. And sadly, in Israel's story, there's moments where you realize, actually, the Israelites didn't get that. They kept doing that from time to time. They kept offering their children as sacrifices, and God kept coming back and saying, hey, don't you remember? I already showed you. I'm the God that will never do it. So reading this as an ancient reader, we should see actually the great moment here comes here. The shock is that God doesn't want child sacrifices and will never demand that. So that's kind of one way to understand this passage. This also is a foundational story. It sets up the rest of the story so well. This is the first time the word love shows up in the whole Bible. This Mount Moriah becomes Mount Zion. This is the place where the temple would be built. And so in so many ways, this is the picture of love where God provides a sacrifice. God provides a sacrifice so that we can be seen by the Lord, so that we can enter God's presence. He doesn't demand blood sacrifice. He doesn't demand our children. He provides the place where we can actually have a relationship with him. And so in the same mountain, the place where God showed, I will never demand your son, I will provide the sacrifice, becomes the later location of the temple built on Mount Zion, where we could come and enter God's presence through the gift of sacrifice. We have to get into the sacrificial system later, but this sets up the whole story here. God provided a way. God provided the sacrifice so that we didn't have to, so that we could enter his presence, so that we could be seen by the Lord and actually have a relationship with him. So I hope this conversation helped you maybe approach this text from a different light. We don't need to be offended as modern readers because God would dare suggest such an atrocious idea. But he actually, it's quite the opposite. He is bringing Abraham to the brink to tell him, I will never demand this of you. I never want you to sacrifice your children. This is a little bit outside the text, but as a personal reflection for me as a father, and maybe for any of us who have kids, this is a challenge to say, is there ways that our culture is still trying to sacrifice our children by being parents that are being overworked in ministry? This happens a lot where we're giving so much to our ministry that we're not actually giving enough to our family, but it happens in the work world as well. And just the way our fast-paced world is actually harming our children. And this passage in that light would actually come in and say, it says to me, it's a challenge to me to say, that's not who God is. God doesn't want me to sacrifice my family on the altar of my work, my success, my ministry, any of that. And God says, no, I've provided a way so that you don't have to do that. There's a lot of other ways that you could take this, but maybe as you reflect on the grace kind of underneath all of this passage and the way that God provided the sacrifice for us, what are the things that he's actually telling you this week? If it's your children or if it's something else, to say, you don't have to sacrifice that. You don't have to sacrifice that because I've already paid the price. There's a lot you can go with that, but let's dive in this week and kind of chew that up a little bit. God bless everyone.